All right, without further ado, I'm Lydia. I'm the executive director of the Virginia Club of New York, the UVA alumni club based in New York City. And it's my pleasure to be co-hosting this program with the UVA Club of Phoenix. We have Kelly on the call here from Phoenix. So if you're joining from the West Coast, thank you so much for coming, especially during the workday probably. But we're so excited to have a bi-coastal event because election news is going on all parts of the country. Everyone has an interesting race. So without further ado, I'm just going to give a few run of show tech stuff. So Paul and Jen are going to get started with a presentation first off, and then they're going to pivot into questions. So thank you all for submitting these amazing pre-submitted questions. I'm going to be kind of informally moderating, choosing from some of the pre-submitted questions. But if you have anything that occurs to you at any time during the presentation or during the Q&A period, you can use the Q&A box to ask your question. And you can also upvote different questions as well. So we'll probably try to ask some of the upvoted questions first. Yeah, so great to see everyone, and we'll get everyone out of here by 7:15 at the latest as well, or 4:15. Yeah. All right. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Paul and Jen. They're both from the UVA Department of Politics. Paul also teaches in the environmental thought and practice major, and Jen also has an appointment with Batten. Both of them are heavily involved in campaigns and election news. So with that, I will hand it off to the two of them. Thank you both for being on this program, and thank you to UVA Clubs for making this possible.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lydia. Thank you, Kelly. We're really happy to be here. I think, Jen, we can start the presentation. We have a few slides we want to walk through, talk a bit about our take on where we are, really just leading up to Election Day. And the first thing that we ought to say is, by way of background, that this year there are 35 seats up in the Senate, and of course all 435 House seats up for grabs. And by way of a starting point, what we know is that historically, traditionally, the party of the president loses seats in a midterm election. In fact, this has happened in all but 4 midterm elections since the Civil War. In 2010, the Republicans picked up 64 seats in the House of Representatives, and Barack Obama referred to this as a shellacking. And in fact, again in 2018, we saw the Democrats pick up 41 seats in the House of Representatives. And so the starting point here, we see similar patterns in the Senate, but it's really pronounced in the House. So our starting point would normally be that we expect Democrats to lose some ground, both in the Senate and in the House. Some people, however, think that there's reason to, or at least thought that there was reason to believe that 2022 might be different.
I can't imagine who those some people might be. So I was the person. And as Paul is going to set the stage, it'll become clear that there are a lot of fundamentals that don't change from election cycle to election cycle. But I was under the impression initially that 2022 might be a little different for a few reasons. The first was that abortion was front and center in a way that it had never before been in a post-Roe era. The second had to do with the fact that the candidate quality differential between Democrats and Republicans in a lot of districts and states was completely glaring. We'll get to that later as well. And the third was that we've reached a point in American politics where the parties are so different and so polarized, and the people who are representing their districts tend to be so congruent with those districts that there's just not that much low-hanging fruit for one party to pick up a seat. It turns out that I was probably wrong.
Well, we'll see, right? It's early, but so what we know is, let's keep going. Democrats, of course, have a majority in the Senate because the vice president casts the deciding vote. And what that means is really the Republicans have to pick up just one net seat. Now, There are, of the 35 races, there are really 4 or maybe 5. Wisconsin looked like it was going to be competitive with the Democratic challenger giving Ron Johnson a run for his money, but that tide has turned. It's still going to be close, but Mandela Barnes is running behind the incumbent senator. That was in Wisconsin. That was a hoped for pickup among the Democrats. Arizona, you all have one of the closest races, Senate races this cycle, with Blake Masters giving Kelly a run for his considerable money, because Mark Kelly is extremely well funded, the incumbent Democrat. That, as of these data are from a New York Times survey that was publicized yesterday, Halloween. It showed Kelly up by 6 points. Pennsylvania, another important state in which Democrats thought this could be a pickup. This was a Republican-held seat, an open seat after a Republican retirement. John Fetterman is leading slightly his challenger, his opponent, Mehmet Oz. We'll talk a little bit more about that race. It's one of the most interesting ones. And of course, Georgia, where the incumbent Democrat, Raphael Warnock, is being challenged incredibly by Herschel Walker, and that race is tight. That is an extremely close race, as is maybe the closest of all of these, Nevada, where the incumbent, Catherine Cortez Masto, being really running neck and neck with Republican Adam Laxalt. So this is where the action is. These are where the really where the hard-fought races are, and what people will be looking toward on election night. Now, political scientists and statisticians are fond of combining these polling data with other data, other information, other fundamental factors about a particular race to try to simulate what might this look like. And this, I suspect, will be familiar to many of you who are regular followers of Nate Silver's 538.com. And what the 538 people do is to run multiple simulations. In fact, here they've simulated the Senate elections 40,000 times, and what they show in their most recent simulation out today is it's 50-50. Right? In 20,000 of the races, Democrats win. In 20,000 of the races, Republicans win. They've shown you 100, a distribution of 100 hypothetical elections here. So where are we in the Senate?
Can I just interject quickly, though?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. Notice that in the races that simulate Republican wins, the Republicans are winning more seats than the Democrats are when they have the majority. So if the Republicans are able to take back the majority, these models predict that they're going to do it with a wider margin than the Democrats would if they win. Okay, good.
Now, these simulations need to be taken with a grain of salt. And I told Jen that I was going to resist temptation, but I didn't. I brought enough for everybody. This is filled with salt because, in fact, the last time I spoke to the UVA Club of New York, I think I entitled the election talk "A Grain of Salt Lecture" in an effort to emphasize, really, even a week out, we are so close. That things are so close that anything can happen, and well, not anything, but it really is up in the air. All right, let's keep going. In the House, Democrats have 220 seats, Republicans have 212 seats. There are 3 vacancies, of which 2 were previously held by Democrats, by Florida Democrats, 1 by an Indiana Republican. And so as a result, if Republicans pick up as few as 5 seats, they will gain control of the House of Representatives. This is the Cook Political Report from this morning, and I should note that our first draft of these slides from yesterday showed only 33 toss-up races. You can see now there are 35, and showed 161 solid Democratic seats. Now there are only 159. What has happened is that this race is shifting from blue to red even in the last week, and that has been the story really since the summer. And given that, let's keep going. Nate Silver's modeling shows that in 40,000 simulations, Republicans win control 82% of the time, Democrats only 18% of the time. So if one were to cast aside one's grains of sand and place a bet on the basis of these aggregated models and these simulations, looks like the Republicans will gain control of the House of Representatives.
What's interesting about all of this is that most of these predictions have absolutely nothing to do with campaigns. And this drives a lot of pundits and pollsters and voters crazy, but political scientists often say that campaigns only matter around the margins. Now, as Paul highlighted, the margins are where the action is in a close election cycle. But I just want to lay out some of the fundamentals that tell us almost everything we need to know before Election Day. So the first is the president's approval rating. And when people approve of the president's party tends to do well in a presidential election year and bleed less in a midterm election. When the president's approval rating is not doing so well, that's often when his party gets a shellacking, as Barack Obama said, and the other party picks up a lot of seats. Notice that Biden's disapproval rating is a lot higher than his approval rating. And what's really interesting is these numbers are almost exactly where Donald Trump was in 2018. And in 2018, with these numbers, Donald Trump lost 41 House seats. The generic ballot is another way to gauge what's going on, again, separate and apart from the candidates in any particular district. This just asks voters across the country whether they would support the Democrat or the Republican running for Congress in their district. And we see that it's a statistical tie right now, which is consistent with what we're seeing, in a lot of these close Senate races as well. What's most important here is that just a year ago, that was not the case. Heading into this election a year ago, it looked like the Democrats were in pretty decent shape, and that has obviously changed. The third factor that tells us a lot about an election, again, separate and apart from the candidates, is where people are. And it's very chic these days to say that you're independent and that you don't want to affiliate with one of the two parties because you don't like the way that the parties are behaving or what they stand for, or you think of yourself as a not, in the box kind of person. But the reality is that when political scientists and pollsters ask people whether they are Republicans, Democrats, independents, or something else, they also ask them if they say independent or something else, if they lean closer to one or the other of the two major parties. And almost everybody does. There are only about 10% of people out there who are true independents. And party leaners behave generally the same way as tried and true partisans do. And so what this means is if you look at these data dating back to 1990, the Democrats and the Republicans are basically in a dead heat for, who has the majority of public opinion in this country. And that's relevant because people vote for the party that they share. And so this is the presidential vote share dating back to 1980. The left-hand columns are the percentage of people who voted for the Democratic candidate. The right-hand side are the people who voted for the Republican. And notice that in almost all cases, the overwhelming majority of Democrats vote for the Democrat and the overwhelming majority of Republicans vote for the Republican. 1980 was the exception. That's when we had these Reagan Democrats. 26% of Democrats cast ballots for Ronald Reagan. But that's basically, the exception. Even in 1984, when Walter Mondale was unable to garner any kind of support and won only his home state of Minnesota, only 21% of Democrats actually voted for Ronald Reagan that time around. And so what this shows us, by the way, I should note, Barack Obama goes around telling everybody how he generated this whole group of Obamacans. These were Republicans who supported Barack Obama. But if you look at 2008, it turns out that only 7% of Republicans supported Barack Obama. So he was not generating the same kind of cult of personality that Ronald Reagan might have in 1980. The reason this is important is because it helps explain what looks like an anomaly in several races. If you look at the Georgia race, for example, Herschel Walker, who is on every dimension a very flawed candidate with a very problematic background, is still getting between 46 and 48% of the vote in all of these polls, running against Raphael Warnock, who's a very compelling candidate. That suggests that the demographics and the party differential in Georgia are such that no candidate on the Republican side is ever going to dip below that 46 or 47%. The same is true in Pennsylvania, where John Fetterman, who's suffering a major health crisis and demonstrated in his recent debate that he's not fully back to where he was prior to the stroke, is polling neck and neck with Mehmet Oz. So again, that has more to do with the fact that 50% of the people living in Pennsylvania are Democrats, and they're going to support the Democratic candidate. I just want to note, though, that party loyalty is necessary, but it's not sufficient. Campaigns do matter around the margins. So issues matter, candidates matter, and election rules matter. Here are Mehmet Oz and John Fetterman. I already mentioned that. Abortion and the extent to which the Democrats are able to mobilize this issue this election cycle can matter, and election rules matter. Turnout, as Paul is going to discuss, is a major factor here, and the extent to which it's easy to vote or difficult to vote can often affect election outcomes. So I don't want anybody to walk away from this thinking that campaigns are irrelevant, that issues, candidates, and election rules are irrelevant. It's just that they only have the potential to matter in a very small set of cases. In this election cycle, though, those small set of cases are what's pivotal and decisive.
Exactly. When we started talking about what we wanted to talk about tonight, I said to Jen that I was watching three things, and I asked her what her three things were. The three things that I'm watching are issues, turnout, and democracy. And I want to talk about those just for a few minutes. And first, with issues, issues matter in the context of campaigns. Jen has already talked about the context in which campaigns might or might not matter. But when registered voters are asked what issues are very important to them in their, very important to their 2022 vote, these data from the Pew Research Center last month, from October 10th to October 16th, are in some ways not surprising. 92% of Republican registered voters say the economy is the top issue. 76% say immigration, 74% violent crime. And if there's anything that is surprising here, it's that 70% say the future of democracy. What about Democrats? The future of democracy is the top issue. 80% of Democrats say that the future of democracy is very important to their 2022 vote. Now, let's be clear. When Republicans and Democrats are thinking about the future of democracy and threats to democracy, they are almost surely thinking about very different things. Republicans are likely thinking about election integrity, whether the votes will be counted accurately. Democrats are probably not thinking as much about November 2020. They're probably thinking about November 2024, but also thinking about January 2021. And so it's the case that these issues are coded in the same way, but they're probably seen in very different contexts by partisans on each side. 79% of Democrats cite healthcare, 75% abortion, another 69% Supreme Court appointments. And I want to just note that what we're looking at here is a really different kind of world in terms of not just how Democrats and Republicans think about one another and think about the out party vis-a-vis their party, but what issues they think are even the important ones. And look at these gaps. 65% of Democrats say that the economy is very important to their 2022 vote, but that's compared to 92% of Republicans. On immigration, it's half the percentage of Democrats, 36%. Violent crime, it's not that Democrats don't care about it, but only 45% say it's very important. Similarly, with respect to abortion, for example, 75% of Democrats, but less than 40%, 39% of Republicans. A very important issue. And as you can see here on the bottom, climate change, 68%, 2/3 of Democrats say that climate change is very important to their votes, but among Republicans, 9%. That is a huge gap, right? And that is a very different view of what issues matter, what issues are important, what issues should be at stake in this election. Now, there is, at the same time that people are perceiving issues as important, candidates and parties and outside groups are spending a lot of money to try to shape those issues and to reflect those issues. And so using data from the the Wesleyan Media Project, we can see that Republican ads and Democratic ads look really different. 47% of Republican ads address the issue of the budget. 43% of Republican ads address taxes, 38% the economy, 34% inflation, 29% public safety. Now, obviously, these don't sum to 100 because you can talk about multiple issues in ads. But look at that: budget, taxes, economy, inflation. That's economy, right? That's all economy followed by crime. On the Democratic side, 46% of Democratic ads address abortion, another 35% healthcare, 24% public safety, prescription drugs, 20%, 19% the budget. So there is a rough correspondence between what Democratic and Republican ads are talking about, what candidates and parties and interest groups are talking about, and what people think are important issues. But in both cases, whether we're looking at ads or looking at the top issues among voters, what we see are really starkly different pictures of what this election is about. Now, when it comes to ads, none of these ads are designed to persuade voters to change their minds about these issues. Rather, these ads are designed to mobilize supporters, to ensure honestly, it doesn't matter what the polls say, right? This is the oldest truism. The only poll that matters is the one on election day. And that's a throwaway line, but it's actually quite true in that it doesn't matter if more people support me, if more of your people turn out to vote on or now before election day. What the ad battle is about is ensuring that as many of your supporters as possible actually turn out to vote. And that's why turnout is what I'm looking at and what I'm watching for. We saw in 2020 that young people really surged for Joe Biden, but that surge is in a larger context in which young people almost never vote at the same levels as older people, middle-aged people, but especially seniors are the most reliable voters. And so one of the things that we'll be watching across the board is differential turnout by age, by gender, certainly by race and ethnicity. And one of the, Jen mentioned a moment ago, the importance of the rules. Well, something that we're watching here in Virginia with respect to turnout is what difference it will make, if any, that for the very first time, you can register to vote right up to and even on election day. Will that matter for voter turnout in 2018 versus 2020 and 2022 versus 2020 and 2018 remains to be seen. I'm looking at that. That's the second thing I'm watching. Issues, turnout, and then finally, democracy, right? We saw a moment ago that according to the Pew Research Center, both Republican and Democratic registered voters see the future of democracy as one of the most important issues. And we've seen this again and again nationally in a New York Times Santa College poll that was conducted earlier in October. Which comes closer to your view? American democracy is currently under threat or not currently under threat? 72% of Americans, registered voters, nationally representative sample, say that American democracy is currently under threat. And last year, one of the great things about Virginia for political scientists or political junkies is that we're constantly having elections, right? We don't just have elections, in presidential elections and midterm elections. We have off-year elections. We had an election, a hugely important, consequential, and closely watched election in November of 21. Glenn Youngkin defeated Terry McAuliffe for governor. And during that election, Jen and I fielded a survey with the support of the Karsh Institute of Democracy here at the University of Virginia. And we asked people, our sample of registered voters, whether they thought that democracy is under attack, democracy is being tested, or democracy is in no danger. So this puts a finer point on the question than the New York Times survey poll that we just looked at. So here we find, first of all, like the national data, one of the really interesting things about this is that although Republicans and Democrats might differ in what they see as the primary threat or danger, there are not a lot of differences when it comes to whether democracy is under threat or in danger. And so what we found, and what the New York Times found just last month, is that Democrats and Republicans look similar here. Almost half of Democrats and a little over half of Republicans in November of 2021 said democracy is under attack. Another 41% of Republicans and 43% of Democrats said democracy is being tested. Under 10% of both groups said that democracy is in no danger, right? We are clearly at a point in which Americans think that democracy is precarious, and we need to take that seriously and think about how that plays out, both before the election, but also after the election. And we may want to talk a little bit more about what that is likely to entail. So those are my top, the top things that I've been watching: issues, turnout, and democracy. How about you, Jen?
So my first thing is that, ironically, this is not a year of the woman. And I'll define year of the woman in a second, but it's ironic because, as Paul indicated, abortion is a top issue for Democrats, and rarely does it garner that amount of attention. It's also been an issue that in the 5 special elections that we've seen for House seats since the Dobbs decision overturned Roe, there's been unprecedented turnout and new registrations among Democratic women who say that they're motivated to register to vote and to turn out because of abortion rights. Generally, I don't know what's happening. Generally speaking, when we see so much attention to women's issues, it often maps onto an increase in the number of female candidates. 1992 was a perfect example of this. But for the first time in 30 years, we're not seeing an uptick in the number of women who are running for Congress. So the numbers aren't substantially down, but whereas 35% of the candidates running in 2020 were women, this time around, we're only at 31%. For the Senate, we're also down from 31 to 29%. Again, not a huge deal, but the overwhelming majority of our elected officials are still men. And that means that the overwhelming majority of the people who are going to be making decisions regarding women's reproductive rights, which we know are important to a large portion of the population, are also men. The other thing I would note is that women's emergence as candidates is lopsided. As recently as 2010, the Democratic and the Republican parties, the blue and the red, were fielding roughly the same number of women running in congressional primaries who would then make it to the general election. There's no bias against female candidates when they run, so the key is getting them to run in the first place. They're then just as likely as men to win. But we've seen since 2010 a huge divergence where the Democrats are continuing to field a relatively increasing number of female candidates, and the Republicans have pretty much plateaued. In 2022, this is another example, the Democrats and the Republicans are not seeing all-time highs, but still the Democrats are fielding a significantly larger proportion of female candidates than the Republicans are. The other reason that it's ironic that it's not a year of the woman is because the Democrats can only win when they exploit the gender gap. So the gender gap is the difference in the percentage of women and men who are supporting the Democratic Party or that year's winning party. And if you look at midterm elections dating back to 1982, we see that the Democrats win when they have larger gender gaps or when they've been able to get men to support them quite a bit. And in 2018, that was a perfect example. You've got 59% of women supporting the Democratic candidate running for Congress compared to only 47% of men. Democrats can't win elections if they can't exploit that gender gap. And so what Republicans want to do is everything they possibly can to mitigate it. And the reason that this is particularly relevant this time around is the gender gap has widened since June. So since the Dobbs decision, we've seen that there has been an increase in the percentage of women who say that they're going to support the Democratic candidate. So again, it's just somewhat strange that this issue is front and center, that female voters are ultimately going to be pivotal in determining the size of the majority that the Republicans get in Congress, and that there are still relatively few of them on the ballot. The second thing I'm looking at are election deniers. There are a ton of them on the ballot. This is overall, there are 291 Republican election deniers running for office. They're favored to win in 171 of their contests. And to demonstrate the power that they might have, 11 of the 27 Republican nominees for Secretary of State are election deniers. That means 11 of the 27 Republicans who could win these positions do not think that Joe Biden was a legitimate winner in 2020. They're going to be the people making decisions about the 2024 election. 22 of 36 Republican governors fall into that category. In the US Senate, 19 of the 35 Republican nominees fall into that category. And regardless of the size of the majority that the Republicans will get in the House, the reality is that the majority of the Republican conference will be people who do not think that Joe Biden was a legitimate winner. And I don't want anybody to think that this is just happening in some places and not others. There are election deniers on the ballot in almost every single state. If you look at Virginia, for example, in all but 3 of the congressional districts in Virginia, the Republican nominee is an election denier. We see Texas, Florida, Georgia, Alabama. It doesn't matter across the board. Even in New York, where you've got more moderate Republicans often running, you have 7 or 8 election deniers. Massachusetts, the same thing. And then the third thing that I'm looking at are prospects for governing, which I would say are kind of bleak. So part of the reason that they're bleak are because of the rules of the Senate. It's very difficult if you don't have a filibuster-proof majority to get anything done, even when you have majority control. We've seen that with the Democrats. But on top of that, Democrats and Republicans have gotten to the point where they just don't like each other anymore. And that makes any degree of compromise that much more difficult. Here are just some basic data from Pew. It's the percentage of Republicans and Democrats who have an unfavorable view of the other party. And if you look just at the overall unfavorables, they've tracked pretty steadily since 1994. About 75% of Republicans have had an unfavorable view of the Democratic Party, and the same is roughly true for Democrats of the Republicans. But if you look at these very unfavorable numbers, they've come to take up a much greater proportion of this negative affect. And we know that when people have strong feelings, that guides their behavior more so than when they're sort of wishy-washy about it. So the fact that Democrats and Republicans have such unfavorable views of each other is problematic for governing. The other thing that I would note is I just want to show you two pieces of data from a survey that Richard Fox and I recently conducted of potential candidates. So these are people who work in the professions that are most likely to lead to political careers. And what we found among Democrats, we said, which would you rather do? Would you rather spend a day with Donald Trump or spend a night in jail, get a colonoscopy, be audited by the IRS, or play a real life version of the Squid Game? 28% of people would rather play a real life version of the Squid Game. That means they would rather die than spend a day with Donald Trump. 50% would rather spend a night in jail. That demonstrates a level of distaste, shall we say, for Donald Trump that exceeds what you would ordinarily expect. Not just the Democrats, though. We asked Republicans, what would you rather do than have dinner with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez? And again, a night in jail, getting a colonoscopy, suffering a mild case of COVID. 31% of people would rather get COVID than have lunch with AOC or have dinner with Kim Jong-un. And the other thing I would note, I didn't put these data up, only about 20% of people on both sides of the aisle chose none of these things. So this is not the same 28% that are saying yes to everything. People were selective and discriminated in terms of what they were willing to give up. But about 80% of Democrats and Republicans would rather have done one of these undesirable things than spend a day or share a meal with someone who they think epitomizes everything that they don't like about the other side of the aisle. So what does that mean for prospects of governing? I'd argue that they're not very good. So that's where our formal presentation ends. And I think that we are happy to take questions at this point.
Awesome. Super interesting. Those polls were insane. So I'm going to start off with a few that have been pre-submitted. And again, just a plug, if anything occurred to you during that presentation, the Q&A box is there. So please continue to submit some live. But first one I'm gonna toss up is from a former student in Professor Freedman's ad seminar. This person is wondering, what is the best political ad you two have seen this cycle?
What a great question from a clearly well-trained former student. So this, I don't know who the student was. I hope that he or she will reach out and let me know. It's really hard to pick. I love them all so much, but in fact, this is a cycle in which so many of these ads kind of look the same and feel pretty bleak. And I think one of the challenges for any candidate in any election when it comes to political advertising is, how do we get people to notice you, right? How do you get, one ad maker refers to the challenge as breaking through the clutter, recognizing that there is just so much, so many messages out there, so many ads that people see again and again. And one way to do this is with humor. And the one recent way to deploy humorous ads is to actually move from more traditional forms of television advertising and move into social media. And we've seen that that's certainly not new this cycle, but we are seeing it done extremely well in 2022. And one of the best practitioners of social media advertising with humor is John Fetterman, the Democratic candidate for senator in Pennsylvania. And Fetterman, who is running against Mehmet Oz, famous, a celebrity in his own right, who until very recently lived in New Jersey. And Fetterman has not let Mehmet Oz nor the voters of Pennsylvania forget this. And I wish we could share these ads, but Fetterman, first of all, he's flown banners on the Jersey shore, over the beach by planes, kind of trolling Oz, saying, "Welcome home, Mehmet," and welcome to New Jersey. And then he's had a series, and these are my favorite ads. He got some really sort of identifiable New Jerseyans to basically record these spots that the Fetterman campaign posted to Twitter, in which first Snooki from Jersey Shore fame, and then Miami Steve Van Zandt of the E Street Band and the Sopranos, talking about how Jersey loves Oz, and he's not kidding anybody. They know that he will always be one of their own. And so this is just such clever, brilliant, but also very simple and effective ways to make a very simple point. Mehmet Oz, you are not from here. You're from New Jersey. So those are my favorite ads of the cycle. Jen, what about you?
It's hard to top Snooki, but I think a similar ad that makes a similar point about being disconnected from the voters was in the Ohio Senate race, where Tim Ryan, who's the Democrat running against J.D. Vance, ran an ad because J.D. Vance was planning on having a big campaign event on that conflicted with a football game. And Tim Ryan was just sort of like, do you not get it? Ohioans care about college football. Yeah. This is not the time to have a campaign event. And it underscored that Vance was sort of out of touch with the typical voter and that he just wasn't from there and didn't get it. So it's the same kind of theme building into that question of authenticity and connectedness.
Super interesting. And then this kind of goes to what, you were talking about sort of at the end there, Jen. Someone has brought up this theory of negative partisanship. And they're saying, do you believe that negative partisanship is the deciding factor in elections today? Or do you hold on to hope that candidates are winning based on earning affirmation of voters more so than disqualifying their opponent through relentless attack messaging?
Well, I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. And I also think that it depends on the candidates. So if you look at the 2016 presidential election, for example, that was one that was entirely rooted in negative partisanship. Both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton had horrible approval ratings. And the question was, how much worse was the opponent? And both sides sort of sucked up their nominee, even though they weren't that thrilled with him or her, and felt that that person was better than the opponent. And almost the entire time was spent on both sides of the aisle trying to let people know how terrible it would be if the other person got elected. In 2020, I don't know that that was the case. I think Joe Biden tried to run a relatively positive campaign. I mean, it's difficult. You're running against Donald Trump in an era of COVID. Like you're limited in how positive you can be. But there was, when he was talking about fighting for the soul of the nation, that's more proactive. It's more upbeat. It's a little bit more inspirational. In House and Senate races, it's a little bit trickier because people aren't paying attention as much. There's not so much of a national campaign. In some of these races, I think Georgia is a perfect example. You can have Raphael Warnock is trying to run a positive campaign. He's trying to get people on board. He needs crossover voters. He needs independent voters. And he can do that to some extent by touting his own credentials and what he's accomplished and his background. But it's also very effective to do that by letting people know how terrible Herschel Walker would be if he were the senator. So, I think that we've reached a point in time where you've got to, if you want to win an election, especially in a close state or a close district, you have to rely on motivating your partisans, both by being proactive and positive, but also by bashing the opponent.
Yeah, but let's be clear. That's not new in 2022,
no.
Right? I mean, this is, we have a word for this. It's called politics. And this has been part of the way in which candidates have made their case, right? There was never some golden era in which candidates just talked about their own merits without pointing out the flaws of their opponents. You have to do that. And, it's not even necessarily something that you would rather not do. It is part of making your case. And I think it's really important as we think about any given race in 2022 in the context of, these larger claims, but also the larger history, to remember that that's what politics is always about.
Awesome. And I saw that Althea typed in the chat something that actually it looks like it disappeared somehow, but it was asking, given the very real threat to reproductive health, why do you think more women aren't running for elected office?
So a couple of reasons. The first has to do with the fact that women are just less likely than men to run for office anyway. And they're less likely to be asked to run. They're less likely to receive encouragement to run from their family members and friends. They're less likely to think they're qualified to run, even when they have the exact same resumes. So that's the case in all political climates. In a really, really depressing piece of news, the gender gap in political ambition is about the same size today as it was 20 years ago. So we're at a point in time where women are still less likely to think about the political arena as an environment that's welcoming and hospitable. That said, there are conditions that make it more likely for women to emerge as candidates. And we would think that the post-Roe environment would be one. Most filing deadlines happened before the decision. And so if we think about the best way to determine whether this is going to be the way that we see a surge of women in politics, it would probably be the 2024 election cycle where we would see that happen, because most of the people that had to file for Congress or for the state legislature who had to get through primaries had to make those decisions, in most cases, even before the Supreme Court decision was leaked, let alone verified. So the lag time is necessary for that. And the other thing I would say that requires lag time is most people don't wake up in the morning and say, okay, I'm running for Congress today, right? You can be motivated to run, but you then have to go through the mechanics of what that entails. And there just wasn't that much time this election cycle. So we'll see what happens in 2024.
But let me just add on to that, right? Because this is a really good question about ambition and people becoming candidates. But more generally, Jen, we've talked a little bit about this. Dobbs comes down, and I think there was a sense among Democrats, certainly the party, candidates, and many rank and file Democrats, Democratic voters, that this was going to be a game changer. I mean, this is why you suggested that the Democrats ever had any hope in 2022 of really bucking the tide and history of losses suffered by the president's party. Do you think? I mean, we were talking. I talked to a colleague after Dobbs came down who kind of looked around his classroom and said, "What are they doing here? Like, shouldn't they be out, like, turning over cars and rioting in the streets? Like, where's the response?" And I feel like that reaction, it really kind of mimics what the Democrats are asking and what they thought was going to happen. And I don't know if it's, should there have been more ads on this? Or is it just that Democrats overestimated how critical this issue was going to be to their base, to young people, etc.? I mean, do you agree that, like, this is sort of the big question about what happened in 2022?
Yeah, but I would add that I have no idea what Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer were doing either, because the best thing that I think they could have done, separate and apart from ads that would be running in districts, are put these guys, because it's mostly guys in the Republican Party, but some women, on the line and have them cast an up-down vote on, do you believe in abortion in cases of rape? A separate vote, do you believe in abortion in cases of incest? A roll call vote, do you believe in abortion in cases where the life of the mother is threatened? Because when you're the minute Dobbs came down, the discussion became about codifying Roe at the federal level. What does that even mean? Do people understand what Roe actually did? It's a complex decision. There's a lot of stuff left to the states. It allows candidates an opportunity, if they're not pro-choice, to sort of morph their responses. It allows them to blunt some of the implications of Dobbs. It allows them to say things like, well, I think this should be left to the states. And people don't understand that that means that their states still have the opportunity to pass tons of restrictions now that would not have been permissible under Roe. And so I think the leadership of the parties missed a major opportunity to make very, very clear to voters where Republicans stood, and now it's too late.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. This is a question that we've gotten that's a little bit geographically centric for Arizona. There's been a lot of news about, voter intimidation efforts there, ballot box monitoring, et cetera. And someone asked, what can be done to cut down on voter intimidation efforts such as that we've seen in Arizona?
Well, it remains to be seen what the courts will do. There was a lawsuit filed recently, and I think there was a case heard today specifically about these ballot box watchers in Maricopa County. And that, of course, is the big one, right? Is to bring legal challenges to actions that are potentially illegal forms of voter intimidation. The larger context, of course, is this tension between those who, and they're mostly Republicans, who are saying that the number one issue with respect to our elections is the integrity of the vote, and people who are concerned about almost completely false claims about what has happened in the most recent elections. But these are giving rise to real concerns among these voters about what might happen. Now, right, we can dismiss them, but we have to recognize that those concerns are real, that they're motivating people, and that I think even Democrats want to ensure that fraud is minimized. Now, on the other side, the thing that we need to balance that against is a commitment to voter access and the ability of people to cast a legal ballot in places that have historically, and I'm not talking about Phoenix or Arizona, I'm talking about everywhere where historically people have been denied their legal right to vote, where there have been obviously efforts to keep people, particularly Black people, particularly people of color more generally, from casting a ballot. That's the context. And so what you've got are pervasive, deeply held concerns that will come into conflict, and the courts have traditionally been the place where these sorts of electoral conflicts have been resolved. Jen, what do you think?
No, I agree with that. I think the challenge moving forward is, as we're making it increasingly unlikely that people will want to serve in volunteer roles at the polls, we're making it increasingly unlikely that people will want to run for local elected positions because of what they're going to have to deal with. We're actually making it easier and easier for people who want to intimidate voters to do what they need to do, because it's incredibly unappealing to be the person that has to take them on.
Yeah, and let's be absolutely clear. An armed man in a mask standing guard at a ballot box is intimidating, right? It just is. Now, does it rise to the level of legal voter intimidation or illegal voter intimidation? That's a court's question, right? But on its face, that's the case. When Jen says it's making it harder for people to volunteer in the election system, well, unarmed people to volunteer, we have an election infrastructure that has worked very, very well. And now, as Jen and I work with folks here in the Department of Elections all over the country. Election officials are being threatened, intimidated, undermined by relentless FOIA requests that, it turns out you can FOIA your way to shutting down an election infrastructure if you're able to make it impossible for the people who are running our elections to do their job.
Super interesting. Have a question in the chat here, which is, can you talk about why legislation passed this congressional session, such as the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure bill, have had so little salience in this cycle?
I think it's tricky to sell economic gains that you've made and legislative successes when people on a daily basis aren't feeling it. So when gas prices are going up, when inflation is going up, when it's harder to put food on the table, when it's difficult to make decisions about, what are you going to do when your heating bill comes and you're not able to pay it? Do you do that, or do you, not send your kids to an extracurricular activity that you have to pay for anymore? Those real day-to-day things are resonating with everybody. And so it's difficult to tout economic successes or, record low unemployment, because it makes you look out of touch with what the average American is going through. Now, I think the Democrats probably could have done a better job with this, not necessarily in a big national campaign, but it's unclear to me that I don't understand why that every single job or every single bridge or road that's receiving infrastructure money doesn't have a big sign on it that says, thank Joe Biden and your Democratic member of Congress, right? If you look back to FDR, you can walk through neighborhoods still today, and there are on sidewalks plaques that say, this is a product of the Public Works Administration.
Or Trump bucks.
Oh yeah, I mean, when he actually sent that. I remember in Rock Creek Park during the right after TARP passed and right after Obama became president, Rock Creek Park in DC, there were a couple of signs that basically said, like, this new road is, thanks to President Obama. But generally speaking, the Democrats have not been very good at this. Pete Buttigieg, I think, is an excellent ambassador for the administration. And he's been going around. I mean, he's had the biggest successes in a lot of ways. The infrastructure bill was his. Sort of touting what those successes are. But I remember early on when the infrastructure bill passed, there was supposed to be something like 1,000 events across the country geared to let people know that these were 1,000 things that this infrastructure bill was going to allow for, and it just never took off. So I think part of it is figuring out how to not seem out of touch when people are struggling, but part of it is that the Democrats have traditionally had a messaging problem.
Yeah, let me add one thing. This is a really good question, but let me suggest that the premise may not be correct, right? Have had such little salience in this cycle. Let me propose that, in fact, they've been extraordinarily salient, certainly in the world of Republican ads, which seek to tie inflation and gas prices and everything related to the economy to the work of the Biden administration and the Democratic Congress, right? So to the extent that Republican candidates and Republican advertising and Republican campaigns have been able to, make this very tight connection between, in particular, the infrastructure bill and the and inflation, they've been extremely important and extremely salient.
Right, but not in terms of the Democrats being able to claim success for two huge
no, exactly.
legislation.
To the contrary. Right. That's my point. They're doing the exact opposite, right? The smartest thing the Democrats did here was to call it the Inflation Reduction Act. They should have called everything the Inflation Reduction Act.
Another question that we have is related to folks on the ballot who are still election deniers. And the question was, have we ever seen anything like this before? And why do you guys think that these candidates are still able to be competitive and even succeed given, kind of the lack of evidence of any of their claims?
So no, we've never seen anything like this. And I think they're successful because Donald Trump knew when he was elected in 2016 that this was something he might have to prepare for. And he spent 4 years making sure that he did everything he could to chip away at any credibility Republicans might have given to the media. He spent 4 years floating conspiracy theories that he talked about as though they were true, even when given evidence to suggest that they weren't. And he made it normal to just say things that flew in the face of reality. And his supporters became sort of inoculated to those kinds of problems. And so by the time it got to the big lie, it didn't seem like a big lie. It just seemed like Tuesday. And, I think that it was, in some ways, I hate to use this word, but it was like sort of a genius way of preparing people for what he probably inevitably knew was going to happen. I think he thought that was probably going to happen in 2016. I don't think he would have been as successful in 2016 because he hadn't had 4 years to continue to, farm the land.
Right. But of course, it's not just Donald J. Trump acting on his own. There is an ecosystem, and a big part of that ecosystem, of course, is the media ecosystem. And right now, Fox News Channel is facing two billion-dollar lawsuits that are actually moving forward by the makers of voting machines, who claim that Fox News Channel, Fox News personalities, anchors, and guests systematically defamed their product, basically. Now, it would be really interesting to watch what happens with these lawsuits, but it speaks to the extent to which the denialism has been enabled and abetted by a media ecosystem that gave voice to these claims, and in some cases continues to.
And I would add that the outcome, not the outcome, the public opinion surrounding the January 6th committee is further evidence of this. I mean, so I'm a political junkie. I've watched every minute of the hearings. I've never seen such damning evidence that Donald Trump knew and was told repeatedly over and over and over again that there was no fraud, that the things that he was going out there and saying were not true. And they did an excellent job, I think, documenting the dates and the people who told him this, and then he would go out the next day and say it anyway, right? Like, so we see a complete refusal to acknowledge what's going on, and public opinion hasn't really shifted. So Republicans who are even we're not only talking about the Trump Republicans, right? We're not only talking about that 30%. Republicans in general are no more inclined to say, oh my gosh, we have a major problem now that they've seen the evidence coming out of the January 6th committee, because they've been sort of, they're just accustomed to it. This is what happens. And they don't trust the two Republican members of the committee. They don't think that the process was appropriate. There are all of these procedural improprieties. And what's lost in all of this is that the president of the United States incited an insurrection. And he very well might be the nominee in 2024.
I'm going to combine two questions that we have kind of based on trends and predictions. The first one is in the chat. It's talking about, early voting, kind of that's emerged, and strong political party preference baked into voting. What's that last week kind of focused on? And this is one that we received early, which was how are pollsters accounting for non-response bias after 2020 election? I think both of these kind of fit in that they're recent trends with polling and how we're receiving data about what elections are looking like. So if you guys could just kind of speak to those two trends, that would be great.
Well, these are both really important and in their own way, both challenges. Certainly with respect to non-response bias, there's a whole slew of challenges facing the polling industry, which has evaluated, assessed, reevaluated, and reassessed both after 2016, then again after 2020, in an attempt to do a better job. It remains to be seen whether they'll do that. Now, a lot of what commercial pollsters do, a lot of what goes on under their hood is kind of proprietary and closely held. A lot of it has to do with how data are weighted after a sample comes in, to try to make adjustments for exactly this differential response. The concern isn't just that people across the board are less likely to talk to pollsters. The concern is that certain people are less likely to respond to either telephone or other sorts of surveys. And I would say that I think we're still in a period of examination and exploration and experimentation. Certainly, when Jen and I got into this game, none of this was taking place over the internet. Now, most of it is taking place over the internet. So there's been a real transformation, even in the mode of election surveys. And you know, the good thing about an election survey is that you know if you were wrong and by how much, and so you can try to do better next time. Most of the public sees that as a failure as opposed to opportunities for improvement. But indeed, with every election, we're learning more about how things work and what doesn't work. With respect to early voting, yeah, this is really, you know, 2020 was a completely different ball game, with the recognition that in the middle of a pandemic, you know, we thought we were in the middle of a pandemic. We're at the beginning of a pandemic. How do you do an election? How do you run an election? And so the rise of early voting, of drop boxes, of mail-in absentee ballot was certainly dramatic in 2020 and laid the foundation for many of the concerns, many of the claims about fraud, et cetera, that we're seeing now. I think that, you know, a lot of people, it's like remote work. People tried it. They said, I kind of like this. Zoom isn't all that bad, at least a few days a week. And I think a lot of people discovered early voting and discovered mail-in voting in 2020 and realized, yeah, this is going to work not only on the part of voters, but on the part of election officials as well. I think it's here to stay, although I expect that we'll see an increase in people voting on election day versus 2020. So it really remains to be seen. Now, it's a good question, right? Like once all of the intense partisans have voted early, what does that mean? What happens during this last week? And I'm going to say that that's a really good research question. That's the sort of thing that political scientists should be asking, right? How does this change not just how voters behave, but how candidates and campaigns seek to reach voters in an election context that looks really different than it used to?
Awesome. And I know we're, kind of almost at time here. So I'm just going to have one more question that was pre-submitted. I think this is interesting because we've been talking a bit about, Fox News and sort of like the, conservative news media. But on the other hand, a lot of mainstream, this commenter pointed out that a lot of, quote unquote, more mainstream news media still is, filled with a lot of fairly left-leaning individuals, and a lot of academia tends to lean left. And so they were wondering, like, is there a possibility of ever receiving truly non-biased election coverage, or is every type of election coverage that you seek out de facto going to have some sort of political spin or bias?
So I really take issue with.
I love that that's what Lydia picks as the last question with 3 minutes left, but
so I really take issue with the premise of the question. I say to students all the time that, as professors, our political ideology and our political views don't affect how we teach in the classroom. We might share those views, but they're largely irrelevant to how we're educating students. Similarly, journalists, over time, we know that as individuals, they're disproportionately registered as Democrats, but that doesn't shape the coverage. There are journalistic norms that shape coverage. There are editors and various checks that shape coverage. There's also partisan news coverage and mainstream news coverage, and those are two very different things. And I think that in the 24-hour news cycle and with cable news, it's become the norm that we kind of conflate these things. And the reality is, if you watch NBC News at 6:30 at night, or CBS or ABC, you're not going to see any kind of partisan anything. If you watch, when Don Lemon had his evening show, you might see more of that. Or if you watch Rachel Maddow, you might see more of that. But those shows themselves are not presenting themselves as straight news. They're presenting themselves as the TV equivalent of like news radio. And so I think it's important for people to step back and consider the source. I'd also note that this idea that the mainstream media are, sort of always in the pocket of the Democrats just doesn't bear out, especially in this election cycle. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette just yesterday endorsed Mehmet Oz over John Fetterman. In a city and in a state that's a blue state, because they think that he'll do the better job. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to consider the source that we're looking at, to consider the mission of what that source is, and to determine whether there's an appropriate place for partisanship or leaning or not. And my hunch is that when you read a lot of what's supposed to be considered objective journalism, it actually is objective. Just because you don't like it doesn't necessarily mean it's not true. Paul?
Yeah, I would echo much of that, particularly with respect to journalism. I believe in journalism, and one of the things I like about journalism is that there are norms and expectations and practices like publishing corrections and expecting to see that. And I tell my students in my media and politics class, that's one of the ways that, you know, you're looking at a real journalistic site if there's a corrections section. So I actually think that I don't really care what my journalist party ID is. What I care about is what her journalism looks like. So I think we're in agreement there. And now, Kelly, we'll turn things back to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Paul and Jennifer, for giving us so much amazing information and insights. We are just 1 week away from a really exciting election day. And if you're like me, I found my sticker because I did that early voting. So for everyone who hasn't done early voting yet, whatever you do, just make sure that you vote. That's one of the best ways for us to keep democracy going, right? So thank you all to the Wahoo community that was here today. Thank you, Lydia, my partner from the East Coast, and for all of those who were able to join us. Thank you so much for being here.